All right, I am here today with Minal Bopaiah, who is the author of a really great book that we're going to talk about today called Equity: How to Design Organizations Where Everybody Thrives. And there we go, there's a little picture of it there for anybody who wants to see it and is watching the video version of our podcast. Now, this book was called A Succinct Jewel by Jody Williams, who's a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, worth looking up herself, by the way. And it was also awarded the 2022 Terry McAdam Book Award for the book most likely to change the way that nonprofit professionals work. And frankly, I'm not surprised. And we'll get into why that is later. Minal's also the founder of Brevity Wit, which is a strategy and design firm that helps organizations achieve the change they want to see in the world. She's a keynote speaker, contributor to the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and well, gosh, I could have shared so much more, Minal, but we've got some
you hit
chatting
the highlights.
About.
That's good.
Yeah, we got the highlights. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, let me give you my 4-word review of this book. I think it's 4.
Please.
Everybody must read this. Like I read a lot of books in this part of my job, and like most books, particularly like books that are business style books or kind of talking about organizations' work, almost all of them have some really kind of interesting points to pick up on. But I would say the difference for me with this one was that I was literally finding it unputdownable, in part because of the stories and how you're telling the stories, but a lot because I found myself questioning what I thought I knew personally and many of the behaviors that I know are kind of have been historically kind of embedded in me. So really, really congratulations on this thing, and thanks for sending it my way. How have things been so far?
With the great.
With the launch.
I mean, yeah, with the launch. Yeah. I mean, it's I don't know at what point you don't say you're launching, but it's been a while.
I think you got about 5 years where you can say
you're launching. But it's been really well received. I think because I'm a first time author, and because I say what I believe, not what's the most marketable thing, maybe.
Yeah, you can tell.
It's like I feel like it's been like a sleeper hit, right? Because it's not like the thing that's the most trending topic, but it's like a long tail. I think people are discovering it and really starting to feel not just that it's a good book, but that it's a good manual that they keep coming back to, particularly people who are doing DEI in organizations.
All right, I'm going to throw you for a loop here a little bit. Do you have a copy of your book to hand?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Okay.
So, sorry about this. I should have warned you, and I didn't. Your the last part of your book, literally the closing thoughts, which is on page 120. If I can help you with that.
Sure. Yeah.
I know it's a little bit long, but would you be okay with reading that?
The whole thing?
Uh-huh.
Okay. If that's what you want. Equity is a big ask. It requires us to examine our fundamental assumptions about the world. It requires us to think hard about the role of systems and structures in our lives, our communities, and our society, and to find a way to make the invisible visible. Mostly, it requires us to dig deep into our internal desire for fairness and summon the courage to do hard things like redesign entire organizations. But equity gives more than it takes. When we meet it with bravery and humility, equity gives us innovation and opportunity. It helps us make everyone's life a little bit better. It can save babies in India, allow girls and boys to see themselves as they never have through media, enable people with disabilities to access the informational power of the internet, help launch new businesses, and ensure that no one's life is determined by their differences. My hope is that this book has opened a door in your mind, a new way of seeing how we can design our organizations, and why equity is so critical to inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, or IDEA, innovation, and the future of work. In showing you this possibility, I also hope you leave with some concrete tools you can use to start designing for more equity in the corner of the world where you have influence and power. If we all simply did that, we would become drops in a tsunami of justice. Remember, everything in the human made world was designed or invented by someone no greater than you. From words to companies, we all make life up as one collective choose your own adventure tale. We are all designers of our shared destiny. No one among us, no matter how marginalized, is unable to make a difference in the lives of the rest of us. We may not see the effects right away, but we all have the power to create a more just and equitable world because creativity is our birthright as humans. When we create more equity and justice, we fulfill a very deep human need. So don't delay. Start designing a more equitable world today, however big or small your efforts may be. It is the only way to know the true depths of your humanity.
Thank you so much. And when I read that, I went, whew. Which is why I wanted you to read it for me. I apologize for like throwing you for a loop there. This was not like
No.
when you're watching Jimmy Fallon on the Tonight Show and they've already predicted something, and he's just like said, "Oh, really? You want me to do that?" I didn't even remember to ask you to do it beforehand. But thank you so much for reading that. And the reason that I wanted you to is because even though it's the closing
Yeah.
thoughts and it sums up so much the themes that are in the book, it's also a great way of kind of opening the discussion, right?
Yeah.
Because there's so much in there that speaks to why this, number one, why this is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, that it is within all of our compasses to do something to have to have an impact on it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think also number three, sort of the way in which you frame it, certainly for me at least, kind of reframes my thinking about these areas and how they interact together. So seriously, thank you so much for kind of opening us up like that.
My pleasure.
Um, I want to um, I want to start with terms,
Mm-hmm.
and I think for people that are like deeply in this field, it's gonna they're obviously already going to intuit this and know this,
Mm-hmm.
but not everybody is as deeply into it. And so specifically, I want to talk about equity versus equality.
Yeah.
In the book, if people
Yeah.
get a physical copy of the book, they'll see a picture that
Yeah.
basically tells you immediately.
Yeah.
But can you, which is for those people that are on the video, it's this picture here. But for those that are listening to the audio
Yeah.
version of this, can you talk to what the difference is there, why both are important, but why they achieve different goals?
Yeah. So equality is basically when everybody gets the same thing. And equity is when people get what they need according to their differences, whether those are innate differences or circumstantial differences. So, the way to sort of visualize this, if you're listening along, is if you have two people and you give them both a bicycle, but one person uses a wheelchair, that bicycle is, you've given them equal things, but it is
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally useless to the person in a wheelchair, right? What a person in a wheelchair needs is either a motorized wheelchair and like sidewalk cutouts that allow them to like progress from the sidewalk to the street to another sidewalk, right? So we understand, in that instance that the same thing is not fair, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so equity refuses to fall, and this is what I love about the disability justice movement. The disability justice movement said individuals are not at fault if they can't access buildings or services. It is the
Mm-hmm.
fault of society to design for differences
Mm-hmm.
because we are all innately different anyway, right? That there is nothing wrong with me, that this has been designed to keep me out, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's really important because so much of how our society has been designed has been on this like false belief of a bell curve and Stepford wives and like that we should all be in these nuclear families with two parents and two kids and a dog and like, and that is not most people's reality, right? Um, that being said, I am also very careful to say that equality is, that doesn't mean we just throw out equality. There are times when equal solutions are more just. And the example I often give is marriage equality. So in the late 90s and early 2000s, there were various legal maneuvers being made to protect same sex relationships. Some states were advocating for marriage equality, some were advocating for civil unions. But then the LGBTQ community got together and they realized that they had to push for marriage equality because if they pushed for civil unions, they would create a legal precedent for separate and eventually separate and unequal, which the
Hmm.
Supreme Court ruled was unconstitutional, right?
Right.
And so, what I often say is that equity and equality are opposite sides of the same coin of justice, and that you need equitable structures to have equal human rights and equal access to opportunity. And so they go hand in hand. They are not either, they are not, I might have used the word versus, but my thinking has refined and it's more of
Yeah.
an ampersand between them than a versus, right? That it's equity and equality get us to a just and fair society.
Yeah. Excellent explanation. So equity is part of a larger picture for, and if anybody, a lot of our listeners are in people operations or
Yeah.
HR, et cetera, and so they'll be very familiar with terms like DEI, DEIB, and
Mhm.
we've looked at some of those in some detail in recent episodes of this pod. I know you're more concerned with how this is implemented than the specific names associated with it,
Yeah.
but you're using an acronym called IDEA.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that is and why you chose that specifically?
Sure. So it stands for inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. And so I am passionate about always including accessibility in DEI work. I think if there is anything that is more entrenched in our societies than racism, I think it's ableism.
Hmm.
And the reason I say that is that we can fundamentally agree at this point in time that you should not incarcerate or imprison someone because of the color of their skin.
Yeah.
We cannot always agree that you should not incarcerate or imprison someone because of a disability or a mental health diagnosis.
Right.
We're still willing to engage in that forms of oppression without a full understanding of those experiences. And we stigmatize and criminalize people with disabilities, particularly mental health disabilities, than we do any other population. And so I'm very passionate about always including accessibility in our work. That being said, and the acronym IDEA came from my mentor, Janetta Betchcole, who is my elder, and I listen to her and do what she says. She's the one person who can tell me what to do, and I will do it. It's also being used by a lot of Gen Z and millennial professionals in the space. There's a wonderful nonprofit called Ideas Generation, which where the idea stands for inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility, and they've added social justice as well. But that being said, Brevity and Wit, we stay on the company that I founded, we say on our site that we are acronym agnostic.
Hmm.
Um, it's, and I think this is sort of my Hindu upbringing. It's like, like there's an expression in Hinduism that truth is one, not truth, truth is one, and sages call it by various names,
Mm.
right? That like, I'm not going to sit here and argue over acronyms. I am, no matter what acronym you use, I am going to have a mind towards bringing disability justice into the work.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, I think there's an interesting link also when you bring accessibility into this, and it'll lead us on to some of the other topics that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Um, I know from my background at Microsoft as well,
Mhm.
when there was a significant movement inside the company to improve Microsoft's overall
Mhm.
story around accessibility,
Mhm.
and it became something where it became deeply connected in terms of the things that were offered from a product perspective and the people that were being hired into the organization.
Mhm.
And you could start to see a direct link between bringing people in that had that were frankly different,
Mhm.
right? Would be the way to
Mhm.
describe it. But were people that would actually take advantage of these accessibility parts of the applications, the
Mhm.
improvement in the design of those, and then hiring those
Mhm.
people into the organization.
Mhm.
I saw it myself in terms of several groups that I could work for. And of course, we are surrounded by things that are useful to society as a whole, but that began as being solutions for particular people. The text messages being obviously being a good example.
Yeah.
Ramps on sidewalks are kind of
Yeah.
universally useful,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So they're not just for wheelchairs. I don't know anybody who doesn't appreciate a ramp on a sidewalk, you know. So
Yeah.
it's and so you start to think about the world in a different way when you start to think about it through these different lenses. And so for that reason, I think it ties in really well to the other thing that you almost uniquely bring into this book, which is the role of design
Yeah.
thinking.
Yeah.
And so you're coming on our pod at an interesting time, Minal, because we just did an episode about design thinking, and then
Okay.
and then before that we just did an episode about DEI and DIB. So you kind of being at the intersection of
Yeah.
those two things is really interesting. Um, your company
Mhm.
uses human centered design as part of your overall approach.
Mhm.
But your section on the design approach to idea, you talk
Mhm.
about the embrace infant warmer,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
I did not know that story.
Mhm.
It did not end up where I expected. so, so tell us about it
Yeah.
and kind of the lessons that we can learn from it.
Sure. Yeah. So this is, I mean, it is a bit of a darling of the story of the human-centered design world.
Hmm.
And I primarily know about it through my friend Rajan Patel, who founded an organization called Dent in Baltimore that teaches design thinking to Baltimore high school students. But Rajan was first a student at Stanford, and Stanford has a design school called the D School. They often get nonprofits to sort of pitch like problems that the students can solve through human-centered design, also known as design thinking, right? Um, and so Rajan and his classmates worked with trying to address the premature births in India and the really high death rates of premature babies, mainly from hypothermia. Right? When babies are born premature, they're often very low weight, don't have enough body fat, and can often die just from being cold. And so they use the design thinking approach, which starts with empathy and really interviewing the people who are experiencing, the people who have a lived experience of this as to what's happening. And that doesn't mean just, mothers and babies, but nurses, doctors, mother-in-laws in India play a big role in this sort of in the birth of a child, right? So they interviewed them, and what they found is first of all, most people in India don't give birth in a hospital. They'll give birth at home or at a rural clinic. Even if they can make it to a hospital, um, a lot of Western-born, what's called NRIs, non-resident Indians like myself, would be shipping incubators to these hospitals, and they would lay there like gathering dust because one, the electricity grid can be unreliable in India. Monsoons can knock out your power. But two, more often, the nurses were like, I don't know how to work this thing, and I'm afraid I'm going to harm the baby putting them in an incubator. But three, and was the most insightful thing that they found, when the mothers, like, they wouldn't have enough incubators for all the babies who were premature, and whoever got the like lotto ticket to have their baby in, that mother would be more stressed and fearful than the other mothers. And that's because her baby's away from her in a machine she doesn't understand, hours after birth, when you're supposed to be bonding like skin to skin,
Hmm.
right? So Rajan and his classmates, went through a very long process. They started a nonprofit to launch this product, and basically created the Embrace Warmer, which is like a swaddle unit with this wax pack that gets heated up that you put in the back that stays an ideal 37 degrees Celsius, which is what's needed to keep a baby warm. And the mother or parent or family members can hold the baby while they're being warmed. And this device, at the time of me writing the book, has saved about 300,000 babies' lives. But more interestingly, since then, there's even a movement to bring the device to the US and
Hmm.
to developed countries. And so I love that story because it illustrates a number of things. One, having worked in nonprofits, I could see how a very well-intentioned but a well-intentioned nonprofit that was sort of baked in white saviorism would feel outrage over babies dying and be like, we need to bring them up to our standard of care and get them incubators. And then we need to have a private sector approach to building out the power grid so that there's reliable power at all the hospitals all the time. And that is pretty much putting a Western frame on a solution to a to an Indian problem, right?
Hmm.
And not honoring both the lived experience and the unique geography and you know ecology of a country, right? So the solution, the story shows what happens if you're willing to let go of white privilege and and genuinely ask somebody about how they're experiencing the world. Um, but then the fact that they're trying to bring it to the US also shows, and this is where the accessibility comes in too, it also shows that when we create inventions that center the people who have been most marginalized, often those innovations are useful to the people who have been historically centered as well.
Yes.
So it becomes a win-win by centering people who have been pushed to the margins the most.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's there is so much behind there, and there's almost that there's an assumption that where this starts, if you're like, we got to
Mhm.
get these incubators into India, that
Yeah.
that by definition it's better, right? As in by
Yeah.
definition, like there's the real version, and then there's this version that will that has got a bunch
Yeah.
of compromises because
Yeah.
I don't know, they're not as clever as we are, or they're not as or they don't
Developed.
really developed as we are, and all that kind of stuff. Versus thinking about what
Yeah.
it really means to create something that people need that is a fundamental human need, right?
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
do you serve a fundamental human need really well? And it may well be that for a whole bunch of reasons that are baked in history, that we've decided to solve this in a particular way and at a certain point innovated and innovated on that original piece of technology, and in doing so lost sight of
Yep.
what some of those original needs are.
Yeah.
And then within that, you start to talk about what is a key tenet of design thinking, which is empathy, and how we kind of get empathy wrong, or a lot of us get
Yeah.
get empathy wrong. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So in addition to design thinking, my firm, we incorporate behavioral science into our work. And so when you look at behavioral science, what they show is that if when people believe in perspective taking, that they can be in somebody else's shoes, often what that tends to trigger is our natural biases towards egotism and stereotyping.
Hmm.
We tend to think we know, but we don't know. We haven't had that lived experience, so we just engage in like media representations of what we think poor people are like, or what we think people of color are like, or what we think women are like, or what we think non-binary and trans people are like, right? Like we don't actually have those experiences, and so we tend to engage in stereotyping, however well-meaning we still do, right? And so Nicholas Eli suggested that instead of perspective taking, we engage in something that I call perspective gathering. And that is really asking and listening to the stories of people who are most affected by the problem you are trying to solve. So, in the case of Rajan, it was listening to mothers and nurses and doctors and mother in laws and family members, right? Um, there's also a story in the book of like when don't during the Obama administration when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was up for like debate,
Hmm.
and a I can't remember the numbers now, but over 1,000 Pentagon like retired military professionals wrote a letter saying it would be catastrophic to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It would reduce morale. And these are people who had years of experience quote unquote, decades, if not centuries, if you added them all up, of experience, but did not have the lived experience of either being gay necessarily or working side by side with someone that they knew at that moment in time.
And
The,
if I can just interject there, because I
yeah,
looked into this a little bit myself, I'm like, as far as I can see looking into that, the assumption might be, oh, that came from a position of prejudice, of like open prejudice, but it appears not to be the
yeah,
case. It appears to be that this was the sole concern here was around the efficacy and the
yeah.
dynamics of the units.
It came
So I
out of
thought that
like,
was yeah,
yeah, like I don't think it was prejudice. It came out of like, how do we protect the unit in
yeah,
everybody's interests? Like, how do we do the greatest good for the most many of people, right? It
mhm,
was
yeah,
well intentioned. The Pentagon, however, was like, let's go actually ask active
uh-huh,
servicemen. And they asked like tens of thousands of active servicemen and their spouses. And most of them said, one, they already knew somebody who was gay and serving.
mhm,
Two, and then like 92% said that they didn't think that it would affect morale at all. And if anything, it would improve morale because people could finally be honest about things.
mhm.
And like to the point that Donald Rumsfeld, who was like like was it Donald Rumsfeld? I might have the name wrong, but whoever was acting secretary like was like, this is a non-event. Like repealing this is a non-event. Like it's not going to have this outsized impact that we think. And we've asked, like it was something like 50,000 people. I'm really bad with numbers and scales
Yeah.
because they don't like mean as much. But it was like on the order a magnitude of 10 of like all of these retired professionals, right? And so that's the power of perspective taking, is that you actually get more accurate data about the impact of a decision or the impact of a solution to a problem than you do if you think that your powers of empathy are so great that you can possibly understand all the impacts when you've never lived that sort of life.
Yeah, that was one of the areas that for me was a little bit mind blowing because I hadn't really thought about that. You think of of that idea of walking a mile in somebody's
Yeah.
shoes as almost being like an act of, I don't know, humility. I want to call it that.
Yeah.
But in
Yeah.
reality, and so it is, generally well
Yeah.
meaning, but there is a certain egocentricity to it, which is
Yeah.
based on this assumption that you're really capable of doing that.
Yeah.
And and so that I've been thinking about that quite a lot because so my just so you know a little bit about me, our audience will a little bit, but I grew up in Oxford, England,
Hmm.
and so which means a bunch of things. I don't know if you spent any time in Oxford, but obviously very high educational level,
Yeah.
but then also lots of multiculturality, I guess you could call it.
Mm-hmm.
Because people are 200 plus countries, I think, are represented by students at University of Oxford, and so that you should never. I don't think you should ever call that a meritocracy, but that kind of,
Yeah.
at least people coming in
Yeah.
from different races and genders and all that kind of stuff. Then lived in London,
Hmm.
and lived in a variety of different parts of London, which itself
Hmm.
is a hot bed
Hmm.
of different cultures. Then moved to Seattle, Washington,
Hmm.
tech hub, so
Hmm.
much the same kind of thing. And today I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma,
Okay.
and I've been here for like a couple of years.
Yeah.
Um, but I've been really thinking about this a great deal, especially as you get to your
Mhm.
the section where you're kind of talking about the group identity wheel, which I know is
Yeah.
not your invention, but it's useful
Yeah.
to have in there. And I start positioning myself on there and thinking about, okay, well, I'm definitely historically centered on education and gender identity and culture, ethnicity. I'm a little bit off on religion, but as I go through this, I'm pretty much centered on
Mhm.
almost on almost everything.
Yeah.
And here I am living in a community
Mhm.
which, if you know anything about the Tulsa Race Massacre,
Yeah.
is very historically marginalized.
Yeah.
And if anybody, last night I saw Killers of the Flower Moon,
Yeah.
and which of course is also in and around Tulsa. So I'm surrounded
Mhm.
by groups of people that have been particularly historically marginalized. So this has got me thinking,
Yeah.
and in particular, what it's got me thinking about is what is the best way, the most effective way
Mhm.
to listen to those voices when walking a mile in their shoes isn't working. I know you've touched on
Yeah.
aspects of this already, but what do you like? What advice would you have for me as somebody who wants to actually understand that world in which I live a little better?
Yeah. So I talk a lot, I talk a bit in the book about there's three different types of empathy. There's emotional empathy, which is what we usually think about, right? Like
Hmm.
your ability to feel what somebody's feeling. There's cognitive empathy, which is your ability to understand a situation. And it's often used by like doctors and paramedics so that you may not be emoting, but you are cognitively there and trying to figure out what a solution will be, right? And then there's empathic concern, which is somebody's ability to really read a room or a person and know what they need. And my mentor, Dr. Cole, is phenomenal at that. But I tend to rely very heavily on cognitive empathy. And it's possibly because I was raised by doctors and my husband's also a
Hmm.
firefighter and paramedic, so I'm kind of surrounded by it. But I feel like it gives you a little bit of the distance. But in cognitive empathy, if I'm willing to be humble enough to say, or at least be willing to take my ego out, like I don't have to feel what they're feeling. The most compassionate thing I can do is when somebody tells you their story, believe them.
Hmm.
Just believe them that that's what the experience was like for them, you know? And I think we do a lot of what if, and if I were in your shoes, I would have done this. But and if it's a friend and you're brainstorming solutions, that's fine. But when somebody's really telling you about their trauma or what their experience was like, you have to believe that it's happened. And I've seen this time and again. Before George Floyd was murdered, I remember talking with a lot of people of color about how we would try to tell white people about experiences of racism, and they'd be like, well, no, maybe they were just being rude to you because of how you were dressed, or maybe it was because like they were having a bad day or they didn't understand and I was like, we knew in our guts what it
Hmm.
was. We knew it viscerally. The way I explain it, it's the way like a woman knows a guy's a creep.
Yeah.
Like we just know it. Like we have antenna for it. And we know it. And you know, if your daughter or your wife were to come to you, and I'm assuming you may not be married, I don't know what the
I
situation
am.
is, but if one's daughter or wife or
Yeah.
sister were to come to them and be like, that guy creeped me out, most of us would believe her, right?
Yeah.
Even right. But like when a person of color, when your friend comes to you and be like, that person was racist, we get super defensive on like all the other reasons it could have been,
Yeah.
right? And the most compassionate thing you can do is to honor that person's own like lived experience um and their own intuition around something. Now that being said, you know, feelings are valid. They are not always factual, right? And there could be other interpretations, but that's not the point. Like this person is coming to you with their pain. And I often talk about when I talk to people of color who want to do diversity, equity, inclusion work, I was like, when you're sharing a story, get really clear on whether you're sharing it to be healed or you're sharing it to educate people of a different identity. Because when you are looking to be healed, what you need are other people who can hold your story without question. But when people are looking to get educated, the process of education often involves asking questions.
Yeah.
And so if you don't want your story questioned, don't share it with people. If you don't want your story questioned, you are looking to get healed. And that means you
Yeah.
shouldn't share it with people who haven't had that same lived experience yet, right? Because they don't have that ability often unless they are a trusted friend who can hold it without question. And so I think we have there are what I mean to say is this is like if you really want to be empathetic, um you have to be curious about their emotional experience, not the facts of the story.
Mm.
And there are times to be emotionally curious, and then there are times to be curious about the facts of a story that maybe doesn't have to do with your friend, right? That we can have both of those conversations, but they don't all they can't happen at the same time, right? So like know which
Yeah.
conversation you're having, right? Are you curious about the history of like racism in Tulsa and race riots and things like that, and you want to go find out the facts about that? Cool, there's plenty of books and resources around that.
Yeah.
And there are books and resources that can play, that can be like, oh, you might think it's this, but here's actually why it's not, or here's why, like immigration law played into it, or housing law is played into it, right? And can give you all those things. But when a human being is sharing their story, that's not the time to be like, well, what was the housing law like at the time,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
right? Like, so I think it's about having this emotional maturity of really honoring people's experiences and lived identities, and empathizing with them for what they are, and not trying to prove them true or false.
Yeah, you just brought back a thought, a memory actually for me. So when I was 17 years old,
Mhm.
my best friend at school, we went to a store. It's closed now, so I can say what it was is Woolworths,
Yeah.
and and so we went there together, and and by the way, like other aspects, because you're like, oh, it might be how you're dressed or whatever. So my friend was always like, he dressed sharp. I
Yeah.
did not,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so we
That's often the case.
yeah, and so we walked. But anyway, we walked into the store,
Yeah.
and there was this what they call pick and mix. I don't know if they call it that here
Mhm.
in America. I can't remember, but where you go like get your candy
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
stuff like
Yeah.
that and fill a bag. So we got that, and then uh, like a soda or whatever. Anyway, so we went to get her stuff, got her
Mhm.
stuff. I know that was it. We looked around looked around that area, and then neither of us ended up getting it. That was it. That was
Yeah.
it. And then we walked out the store, and then as we walked out the store together, together the whole time, security guard comes up to my friend and wants to know what he's got in his pockets.
Yeah.
And the fascinating thing about that for me was that I considered myself like aware
Yeah.
of all of the stuff that was going on, but that was the first experience
Yeah.
where I had behaved absolutely identically
Yeah.
to this other human being, but this other human being was singled out, and there were two things that distressed me, like personally distressed me.
Mhm.
One, the fact that it happened. Two, the fact that my friend was like, "Oh, don't worry, it happens all the time."
Yeah.
So, as in his acceptance
Yeah.
of what was like completely
Yeah.
unjust
Yeah.
was an experience that
Yeah.
what are we? I'm 52, and I remember
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
and I'll never forget that. So that the point is that everything before that's theoretical at that moment because I'm so proximal to it. Now all of a sudden I've got some idea.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm not experiencing the
Yeah.
other 20 times it's happening, but I've got just some idea as to what that means. And you're right, it is different. It is a different form of understanding.
Yeah.
Um,
And there's even a greater understanding, because what I think most people don't realize is like when those things start to happen like time and time again, it's
mhm.
like Chinese water torture. I don't know if
Yeah,
that may not be politically correct, but it's like water torture,
but it's yeah,
right? It's drip by drip by drip that erode, and it's like it is, and so people then explode when they're 40 over
yeah,
one thing, and people are like, why are you so angry over this one thing? It happens all the time. I was like, because it happens all the time, I'm angry
yeah,
because I'm exhausted. I'm
yeah,
exhausted by the amount of resilience it's taken to not be bitter and angry about this, right? And that
yeah,
is the part that I think people see one experience and they think they get it, but the actual trauma is in the accumulation, not in the one experience.
hmm,
You can write off one incident.
yeah,
The trauma and the oppression is in the accumulation of it.
yeah.
You
Huh.
know?
All right. Gosh, so many places we could take this, but I want to I want to focus on something where I think there's probably a little bit of connection in terms of what our two organizations do. So we focus at Billion Minds a lot on a tension that I personally call me versus we.
Mm,
And so the way that I think about me versus we is the balance that employees and in fact their companies need to have between meeting their own needs, making sure that
yeah,
their own needs are being met,
yeah,
and then the other thing, which is also important, particularly in team and organizational things, which is collaborating for the greater good,
yeah,
right? So
yeah,
how do you that which is different in different cultures. For example, so
Yeah.
some of the countries we work in, there is more cultural emphasis on the idea of what's the output of the team. You might reward
Mm,
teams in a different way than you reward versus rewarding individuals. So here in the US, we
mhm,
tend to reward a lot more individual
mhm,
behaviors.
mhm,
In certain other countries, they might,
mhm,
and certain other company cultures, they might put
mhm,
almost all of the emphasis on the output of the team because they're really focused on improving team dynamics.
mhm,
So you discuss in the book, you bring it up
mhm.
several times, the concept of rugged individualism, which I
Yeah.
think is a term some people will know, but some people won't. So, can you introduce that term, rugged individualism,
Yeah.
and discuss why you think it creates challenges for how organizations work,
Yeah.
particularly if they're looking to introduce equity?
Yeah. So, rugged individualism is this belief that we can all that we can go it alone. That each man is an island, right? That like, and often men, uh,
Hmm.
that like, right? And so that the opposite of rugged individualism is interdependence. It's not collectivism, right? And so it's interdependence, and interdependence is a fact. It is one of the few things that science and religion agree on.
Hmm.
Like scientific
Yeah.
study, we live in a multivariable world. There is no like independent and dependent variables in like what we're dealing with, right? Um, but what's baked into interdependence is this um, dance between um, like autonomy and um, the collective good,
Hmm.
right? So at Brevity and Wit, our two main organizational values are sovereignty and interdependence. And this is what I think this work is about, is threading the needle that like diversity, equity, inclusion should allow for liberation, which means that doesn't mean you're free to do everything without consequence. It
Hmm.
means that you have sovereignty, which means the right to rule yourself, to decide what is in your best interest and to pursue it. But the complementary value is interdependence, meaning that you acknowledge that your actions affect people around you and systems around you and things around you, right? None of us live in a bubble. Why rugged individualism is so toxic is because it's basically perpetuating this myth that we can live in a bubble and our actions don't affect others, right? And we saw this during the pandemic. Like if you choose not to get vaccinated or go around unmasked, you affect the health of other individuals,
Hmm.
right? And so and that being said, if you are, you know, if you are deaf and hard of hearing and rely on reading lips to some extent in dealing with people, masking becomes really problematic, right? So that
Hmm.
there is this constant interplay between sovereignty and interdependence. But sovereignty and the right to rule yourself is very different from rugged individualism and a false belief that you go it alone, because nobody does, right?
Yeah.
There are like the only, the classic story that makes me think about this is Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Walden Pond.
Yeah.
And he writes all about this sort of idea of like self-reliance and like, which, in general is okay, but taken to the extreme is ridiculous. And what people don't know is that every Sunday, his mother and sister used to come by with donuts.
Hmm.
And so he has written a book that, like, there's no women in his writing,
Hmm.
right? And this idea of self-reliance only exists when you erase women from the narrative.
Yeah.
Right? That
Yeah.
like this, like that, the main way that that narrative has been perpetuated is by erasing women and the amount of emotional and cognitive labor they have done for free,
Yeah.
you know? And so rugged individualism, I don't mean to. The reason I say it's not collectivism is because sometimes people think that this is moving away from individualism to collectivism. But
Yeah, and it
having
sounds almost like a conflict between two political systems,
or
which is
to
not
like
what we're talking about.
cultures and
Yeah.
people, and but coming from, being a descendant of India, which is a much more collectivistic culture, it's not like there's not oppression in collectivistic cultures.
Hmm.
Like the patriarchy is strong in India in ways that are really really bad. And so I'm not of the belief that just being collectivistic is going to be able to stop oppression.
Hmm.
That the goal is to stop oppression, which means to give people the right to choose. But part of that freedom also includes accountability to be held responsible for what you choose,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. To tie it back to sort of what we've been doing inside organizations on this,
Mm.
um, the reason that we call this me versus we is to kind of highlight the fact that there, in many people's minds,
Mhm.
there is a tension between
Yeah.
those two things, right? So the end goal of it
Yeah.
is like me and we, as it were,
Yeah.
but it's framed in many ways for many people as in that way.
Yeah.
So, for example, conflict you see every day inside
Yeah.
organizations, whereby people will be wanting to structure and frame their work in a very individualistic way, with no
Yeah.
thought as to whether you're pushing somebody else's project back,
Yeah.
or whether you're
Yeah.
making, or whether you're hoarding and
Yeah.
hiding your work that other people can't use, or any of that kind
Yeah.
of stuff. And then your reason for it was, well, I'm just, I'm just being me, right?
Yeah.
I'm just,
Yeah.
I'm just self-optimizing and doing the best
Yeah.
that I can
Yeah.
do,
Yeah.
keeping it real, whatever it happens to be, right?
Yeah.
And so these things become almost like embedded
Yeah.
as, well, that's how I measured, that's how I managed,
Yeah.
that's how I
Yeah.
that's what you would expect of me. And of course, the ultimate outcome associated with that is, in many cases, teams of high performing individuals, but they are teams of high performing individuals. They are not high performing teams. And
Mm.
so ultimately, like, where we need to get to your
Yeah.
point, is a point where everybody's ability to thrive as an
Yeah.
individual is there,
Yeah.
but that there's also a recognition that in order for the team to do well and the organization to do well, that there is an interdependency
Yeah.
aspect of this that needs to be addressed as well. And
Yeah.
part of considering other people's needs
Yeah.
is a selfless act, as well as the individual claiming it as a selfish act. So to me, that, I think it's one of the most fascinating things of this kind of work and stuff, that when, as you highlight these embedded things like rugged individualism, it kind of illustrates the challenges and the backdrop in which we're trying to do this type of work.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's I call it like symbiosis. How
Hmm.
can like how can your needs and the needs of the organization be met? And sometimes it comes down to compatibility, right? Like we need to
Yeah.
like it's I think sometimes think if people think of an organization, if they didn't fit in, that they are unqualified, they're less worthy. But I'm like, I don't know. I tend to. It's more like dating. It's like you're incompatible.
Hmm.
What you need and what the other person needs are not like lining up, so you can't take it that personally. And the best idea is to keep moving until you find a place that's like compatible with you, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's really I think if we could take away the worthiness judgment when people's needs are in conflict with the organization, it makes it easier to have an honest conversation about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Huh. Um, all right, last couple of questions here, because I know we're running up on time a little bit.
Yeah,
I've got two more that I want to quickly address.
sure.
So the first one is something that's kind of been bugging me a little bit,
Hmm. Hmm.
because I say, like, your book wasn't just read the words, right? It, like,
Hmm.
you created thoughts in me. So so mine is really the thing that I've been bugged by recently, has been, I would say, the organizational change management piece of this.
Mm.
So we're living in a very interesting time. I guess we probably have been for the last couple of 100 years. But certain forms of discrimination, let's talk about that piece a little bit,
Hmm.
are not just prevalent, but they're even socially acceptable in some circles. And certainly, if you take an international view, that changes. What is socially acceptable changes fairly dramatically.
Hmm.
Now, if you're in a big company, you've almost certainly got people that are strongly convicted with the idea that certain forms of equity are a personal challenge to them, and that don't meet with their personal convictions. I think you touched a little bit on it before, but it's
Hmm.
even more of a challenge with like larger companies.
Hmm.
Um, so obviously, convicted and clear leadership plays an important part of this in
Hmm.
terms of describing what kind of a company you are.
Hmm.
Um, but I think about, I don't know, Disney, for example, comes up a lot right now in terms of what Disney is doing inside its inside its organization,
Yeah.
and then the environment
Mhm.
in which that all exists. But I'm curious about how you effectively communicate and change behaviors against the reality of that background, whereby certain things you're looking to do are things whereby people in your organization, some of them at least, are deeply convicted that it threatens them personally or is something that they disagree with, and will even, vote on the basis of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where leadership has to embrace its power and use it responsibly.
Hmm.
I think organizations are not democracies. The staff are not going to vote out the CEO.
Hmm.
So you, as the CEO, have the power to decide what the rules of the road are,
Hmm.
and people can have their own private opinions. This work is not about propaganda and getting people to think one way. What it is about is behavior and culture change, which means how do
Hmm.
we act in public with one another or in the privacy of our organization, right? And so I think if whatever people's thoughts are, what we focus on is what is the observable behaviors of this work. So like I give an example, my husband's a firefighter, talk about a crowd that's like resistance to change, right? And they might have lots of different opinions about trans individuals and what they think about whether it's right or moral, whatever, right? It doesn't matter because they know that their standard of professionalism when they're on a call is to ask someone what their pronouns are and use them.
Hmm.
I don't care what you think.
Yeah.
Your thoughts are irrelevant to you doing your job.
Yeah.
Right? That is the standard of professionalism that they are expected to. Now, there may be a lot of talk in the firehouse that's, transphobic, that I wouldn't want to be around, that would make it difficult for somebody who was trans to be a firefighter in the firehouse. And that stuff needs to be addressed too. But you start at the most basic level of like, what is the observable behavior? And even if that stuff is true, then the rules become you are not allowed to say things that make anybody feel like to imply that somebody is a lesser human being for being different. That's also
Hmm.
the rules of like an organization, right? And this is why I think like this language sometimes about authentic self can get easily weaponized because I mean, listen, I'm very authentic. I like other people who are, but if your authentic self is an alt-right troll, you don't need to bring that to work. Don't
Yeah.
bring your authentic self to work. It's not
Yeah.
welcome here. Right? That like and so I think you set a culture by saying here are the observable behaviors. And that's even Brene Brown says like values without observable behaviors are BS.
Hmm.
So when you say you value inclusion and equity, you need to state what are the observable behaviors of inclusion and equity that you are asking people to engage in. Like when Brevity and Wit, we say our values are sovereignty and interdependence, we have very clear observable behaviors of what that means when you're working on projects,
Hmm.
right? So like you got to translate your values into observable behaviors. You got to speak in specifics instead of speaking in ideals in order to move people along.
Makes sense. You said companies are not democracies. I'd probably add companies are not Twitter or X.
They're not. I mean,
uh,
they're not the worst place ever, but that doesn't mean that they can't become more inclusive and democratic, but the way power is structured is different. And so good
yeah,
DEI practitioners understand that grassroots movements in companies are not going to be effective the way they are in society. And
yeah,
you have to change your model of intervention. And I think right now there's also a lot of backlash because there's been some shoddy DEI work by people who don't understand organizational development and how power works in organizations.
yeah. I completely concur with that. All right,
Yeah.
last question.
Yeah.
Um, I would imagine, even though at times this work can be very rewarding, I would imagine at other times it might be a bit dispiriting. I mean, it's certainly not like straightforward path towards progress. So,
Yeah.
what drives you on?
Mm,
What's your, and I think
yeah.
possibly more importantly, what's your dream future state for society as a whole as a result of this work?
Oh. Okay. So here's where I'm going to get very Hindu and Buddhist on you and say that
Good.
I actually don't I don't really have that, or if I do, I don't nurture it or encourage it because I think that's really dangerous.
Hmm.
Um and like I think if you are attached to the goal of this work, you will not last. You got to love the process. Like you like when I entered into DI, I was like, "Oh, this is the thing I could do that I wouldn't get tired of talking about." And I want to talk about this for the rest of my life and do this work knowing full well that there are forces working against me. Um and yet, like we are, in Buddhism they have this analogy that we are all nodes in a cosmic net.
Hmm.
And your responsibility is the integrity of your node and the quality of your connections to the other nodes. You're not responsible for the net. And there is a level of egotism and saviorism if you think that your vision of the world you can implant on everybody else. You can't. My job is to do what lights me up as well as I can with integrity, right? And then I have to be somewhat detached from the results, but also know that we're working on much longer timelines. And the story I often tell is of my mentor, Janetta Cole. She was the first African American woman president of Spelman in 1987. And she was very good friends with Audre Lorde. And so she was very like gay friendly back in the 80s when a lot of people were not, particularly
Hmm.
people who were part of the Black community because of the Black church.
Yeah.
And so when Spelman, there was a lesbian association that got up during a talk and said, we're not getting recognized. And she's like, without talking to anybody, she's like, I'm telling you right now, as president of this college, I recognize you. And then there was a swift backlash from parents who, because Spelman is rooted in the Black church and the Black church was very homophobic. And she talks about how that made her, or used to be very, or maybe still, it depends which church, but she talks about how she learned in that moment how one can be both victim and victimizer, right?
Hmm.
But the story doesn't end there because 30 years later, um, Spelman was the second HBCU to admit transgender students. And the first was Bennett College, where she had also served as president.
Wow.
And so these are the timelines that we're working on. This work is fundamentally about planting seeds for trees you will not sit under.
Yeah.
And you got to love the planting. Like it is like farm, like you got to just love planting and hope that people will like take up the baton and continue to steward your work after you're gone. You got to be that detached from it and you got to love it like that. Like I love what I do. I'm not doing this out of obligation or guilt. I do it because I love it, right? And well, who was it? Howard Thurman who said like, don't ask what the world needs. Ask what lights you up because what the world needs are people who are lit from within.
Yeah.
So that's how you keep going is you find out what lights you from within and do that. And do it with a social justice lens, but do that.
Well, perfect spot to leave it for the second time this podcast. Wow. The there's the book again. Equity: How to Design Organizations Where Everyone Thrives. And I kind of alluded to it before when I said everybody needs to read this. Like anybody that is just interested in things. I know that sounds ridiculous, but but that was the thing. I just found it so fascinating to read such a thoughtful treatise on how to on this area. Something I thought I knew a reasonable amount about, and then came out of it with that classic Dunning Kruger thing, where I was like, "Oh no, I know a lot less about it than I thought I did." So it's so just wonderful talking to you today, Minal. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.